Hello, I'm Mark Tucker,
Hey, I'm Alan Furstenberg, and welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Hey, Alan.
Hey, Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well. Tired, but pretty well.
Well, hopefully you get over the extended feeling of tired after you've traveled around different places on the country and the world. So
Someday, someday that might
someday.
be nice. Yes. So we got some pretty, I don't know. I guess I'd call it disappointing news in the
Yeah,
past week or so.
yeah. I would classify as it disappointing, but also kind of an opportunity to celebrate. So you know that I've said a number of times on the podcast here that one of my favorite frameworks for creating Alexa skills back in the day when I was doing that more, voice assistants, chatbots, is a framework called Jovo. It's open source and was created back in 2017. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, but they announced that they are going to archive their GitHub repo. It's still available to use as is, and it's also available to create a fork and continue on with that for those people that are still using it in their projects. So we'll also touch on kind of the future going forward with how you might still use it if that's something that's of interest.
No, it's sad to hear that they've wrapped things up. So why don't you, I guess, tell us first what Jovo was, what it did, why it was different, unique, and useful.
Yeah, so I'll kind of talk a little bit about my experience, how I started with Alexa skill development, which also involved into Google Assistant, which at first started with Dialogflow and then kind of changed the approach that they took to creating those with the Assistant framework, if I'm remembering the terminology correctly. So I started doing Alexa skill development back in 2016, and kind of experimented with a little bit more hobby and stuff in 2016. Actually started using it for consulting gigs that I was on to use it. And so the what I used to initially start to create Alexa skills was the Alexa Skills Kit, Ask for short, version 1. And that focused on how to create the back end side of kind of the server API side of things. You'd get a request that was basically what intent and slots that the user had spoken to Alexa, and then this Ask framework would process that, and then you could use state management and database and other tools, call APIs, whatever it was that your skill did, and build up the response, which would go back via text to speech. So that's kind of how I first started off doing Alexa skill development. But
And
in
that was
27,
a
yeah,
pretty common experience for most people.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it
it was,
was it's not a great developer experience.
yeah, it's well, it was okay, but it was definitely very, Alexa's, one, it was Alexa specific, and it just, it was, um, sometimes it trailed a little bit on when new features came out. You had to wait for the Alexa Skills Kit to come out. There's just a few things with that. I started, I got, like I said, version upgrade to version 2 of the Alexa Skills Kit and started doing some stuff with that. Um, there were some changes on, some breaking changes on how that worked. Um, but it was about that same time that I had a project where we wanted to do a voice experience for both Alexa and for Google. And just the thought of creating, one thing in Alexa and then kind of the same functionality, but in a completely different framework for Google, kind of like spawned we wanted to go out and just check to see what was out there as far as different options for frameworks. And we came across the Jovo framework because they came out in 2017. And so we ported some of the stuff that we had over to Jovo version 1 and started working on that, and just discovered that we really liked how the framework was allowed us to handle that. And back at that time, it was really just support for Alexa and for Google. There really wasn't any other players. It was kind of had started off with that thing in mind. with having it code once and use it on both of those two platforms. So that's kind of how Jovo 1 and Jovo 2 kind of were focused when we started. So, but just really got a lot of hours behind me as I was doing these different projects. Really came to understand some of the vision of what they were trying to accomplish. Jovo version 3 was a little bit of a bigger jump. Had to do some migration of some of our projects over to that, and not that it was like huge, but there was definitely some changes that had to happen. And then version 4 of Jovo, which is the current version that it's on, was quite a bit bigger change. A lot more flexibility in some of the ways that approach things. Also, it was kind of the jump that I made from JavaScript to TypeScript programming. It's kind of happened at about that same time. It was a good time to switch. They were doing stuff in TypeScript, so it was a good opportunity to kind of jump to that. So that's kind of my experience with it. But let's talk about what Jovo was.
Before we get to that, so it's kind of funny. I actually, and I don't think that this really clicked until much later. I actually ran into Jan when one of the developers, I guess pretty early on in Jovo's lifetime, and very early on in my development experience with Google Assistant. I had probably just started working on multivocal, and I attended a voice user group meeting in New York City. And
Oh,
it
okay.
was just a general get developers who were doing this sort of stuff together. And Jan was one of the presenters that evening, talking about this relatively new project called Jovo, which had already gotten a bunch of developers on board who were
Yeah.
interested in working with it. And he and I chatted for a few minutes after the meeting. I told him about where I was going with multivocal and where he was going with Jovo. And we were going in different directions. But it was interesting to kind of see the people that were, where the vision was early on.
Yeah.
In this goal of making it easier to develop these voice applications and make it cross-platform, so we didn't force people into a vendor lock-in, and build levels of abstraction so that all of the complicated stuff was kind of abstracted away a little bit,
Yeah.
and we could focus on doing the more important business. And we saw similar stuff with voice flow as well, trying to take similar but different track.
Right. Yeah. So shout out to the co-founders, Jan and Alex. They were the main developers who kind of formed the company and had the vision of what Jovo could be. And there was a time where their team had grown. I'm not sure how big, if it was as many as 10 developers at one point. It's kind of interesting because you said that they visited New York. They traveled around. Jovo is actually based out of Berlin in Germany, and they created the company and this framework back in 2017. And on LinkedIn, it says this is how they advertise their company, Jovo. Jovo is the open source voice layer. Build voice experiences that work across platforms and devices, including Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, Samsung Bixby, web apps, mobile phones, and more. So that's kind of the vision that they had. And one of the things that they've kind of advertised it or kind of branded it as like the React for voice applications. Other times I've heard them compare it to like Next.js, which was a framework that you could use to build web applications, but have something similar. But their main library was the Jovo framework, and it's written in TypeScript, and you can develop with either JavaScript or TypeScript, and it's Apache open source license. The thing that I liked about it, especially with the newer version 4 upgrade, was just their vision. In fact, I'll have a link to the video that I created, but it was talking about an introduction to Jovo and what the four P's were. So one was the purpose of what was the purpose of the Jovo framework, and it talked about what you would have to do if you were creating a voice application from scratch, if you were just building a some sort of an API framework, and what types of things that Jovo did for you. So that was kind of like the first P was the purpose. But then they talked about platforms, pipelines, and plugins. So one of the things that was interesting about Jovo is that they had different platforms. So Alexa was a platform, Google Assistant was a platform, Facebook Messenger was a platform. So if you think about the way that some of these different frameworks worked, is that they're in the end some sort of a webhook, like a HTTPS post endpoint that would accept a JSON request object, and in the end respond with a JSON response object. But those had certain formats, certain fields in certain places, and so that's what the platform took care of. It took care of translating the request coming in into a request object that was specific to the platform.
And that would then get passed to your application.
Yeah, but then there was also kind of like a genericized version of a request or a response or different things, so that your code could focus on dealing with the request and response and not necessarily have to do the translation from what the HTTP body was coming in and what is expected. You could all just kind of deal with a request in one way, and just worry about like each of the different handlers were for different intents, and you could get access to the different slot values if there were slots or entities in it.
And so this is what Jovo took care of, was translating
Yeah.
from this platform specific one to this abstracted version of a voice request, and then
Yeah.
do the same thing in reverse.
Exactly. So if you think about it, when a request comes in, then depending on what type of platform, like with Alexa, you were given intents and slots. But on Google, you were given the actual string that the user had spoken or typed.
Well, in
And there'd have
addition
to
to
be
the
some sort
intent
of
of in addition
well, yeah,
to the
okay. In addition to that, true. But if you were creating just a web chat bot, then you would have just the text. So some of the different steps that the request would have to go through is depending on what type of request that you got. You might have to do automatic speech recognition if you wanted to convert voice to text. You might have the text, and you want to run that through some sort of a natural language understanding to get what the intent and the slot was, if that wasn't something that the platform did before it sent you the JSON. And then depending on what the input was, you'd have to route it to a specific handler, and you could use information from state stored in a database for a specific user, either user session state or cross session user storage. But then you'd build out the response. It would have to do the conversion ultimately into the output format and text to speech to then do the response. Now, all of that step from requests coming in to all the stuff that it did to response coming back was actually a pipeline. So each of the different things, request, NLU type of stuff, routing, handling the request, doing formatting the output, doing text to speech, all of that stuff were different steps in this pipeline. And the power of Jovo was not only that pipeline and the different platforms, but with plugins. In fact, a platform itself was a plugin that would just plug into this pipeline. So the request would come in, start to hit the pipeline. It would figure out from how the request looked, which of the different platforms that it was, and do the conversion. And then you would go through and you could create very different plugins if you wanted to have your data stored in a DynamoDB table, that you could, a MySQL table you could. It would just be take one plugin and out and plug in a different plugin, and all of a sudden, your code doesn't change,
Right.
because your plugin was written against a specific stage in the pipeline and had data, knew what the data looked like, and so it could react with it.
And this is the usefulness of abstraction layers in general, is being able to say, we know that in general these are the things that it needs to do, but the details we can we can abstract away and then have the plugins that fill that in. If we want to look at analogies to to where we are currently with large language models and the libraries around them, we've got things like LangChain, which abstracts an LLM itself. I mean, all of them are abstracting LLMs itself, but also abstracting, how do we do conversation stores? And how do we do document retrieval? And all of these things are, abstracted so that underneath the specifics can be whatever implementation we need. And you
Right.
see things like GenKit is doing the same thing. So that they've abstracted away this notion of what an LLM is and does, and then left you to focus on the important part about what are you trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because even something like voice flow, there's a visual designer, and you can create some sort of an agent or an assistant, but behind the scenes there is a output of a JSON format which talks about the conversation flows and the different nodes, and there's a runtime where you can run that runtime against that JSON, configuration. I'm not sure what their official term is, but then you've got the chatbot, that you can host anywhere. And in fact, I created a plugin for Jovo that would allow you to then use that runtime as part of a Jovo application. So there's just a lot of flexibility. And I think, one, I'm still using Jovo in projects that I'm working on, and that will probably continue on for the foreseeable future.
And we'll get to that in a few minutes, I'm sure.
And so I think there's still some stuff that you might want to investigate if you're not using Jovo, because there's a lot of intellectual property thought, everything that went into it, that there might be some things that you can learn or see how you might be able to adapt some of the things from that project into things that you might be interested in working on.
So I guess that brings us to what happened. What's the announcement that is prompting all of this?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there was an official announcement on the Jovo Slack group that project, which is open source, is available on GitHub, is going to be archived, which means that there's not going to be any active, ongoing updates to that repo anymore. And there's a number of different projects in that repo that are useful that do different things. The main one being Jovo Framework. There's also a Jovo command line interface, a CLI. Jovo Model is another one, and there's an interesting webhook debugger, which was one of my favorite features actually of Jovo. So they open source the code to that. The current version of Jovo Framework is 4.6.2, but it really hasn't been updated for the last 6 months. There are some open issues. Some simple things like Dependabot, making sure that some of the versions are updated. Because the repo is archived, you can just use it as is. If you're still using it and you don't really need any additional features to it, and are not necessarily worrying about dependencies of that Jovo is using being updated, then there's really not much you have to do. You could still continue to use it, continue to use npm install.
And I think that's important. And I think that's important to note is that the open source library itself isn't vanishing.
Yep.
It's open source, so at this point, anybody has access to it, and if you've been using it, you can continue using it. If you want to start using it, you can start using it if it meets your needs. It's out there, and that part isn't changing.
Correct.
And
it's like I say, it's open source. It's Apache. It's going to remain open source. But what's going away is like that Jovo debugger that I talked about. There was actually a webhook, some servers that were set up to be an intermediary there to connect to. Those servers are going down. They're not paying for those resources. www.jovo.tech is their website. And by the time that this podcast airs, or by the end of the year, probably, then the website, the Jovo website will no longer be active.
And that includes all of their documentation, though, doesn't it?
It does include their documentation. Now, interestingly, their documentation is actually generated from MD documents that are inside the repo for the project.
Okay.
So you could find it. It's just not easily searchable, nice format, but you can still get to some of the details on how the framework works, and it's just not access to the website.
Okay, so the documentation's been open sourced as well, basically.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So I'm just going to spend just a quick 2 minutes and kind of read the official announcement from Jan and Alex. So it says, "Dear community, after almost 8 years of working on this project, Alex and I had to make the difficult decision to close Jovo. We're still financing server costs, accountants, etc. through other projects, and we don't have the capacity anymore to do this. What this means for you. All Jovo packages will stay on NPM in their current versions. Like I say, that's 4.6.2. So you can keep using them in your projects. We will archive the Jovo organization on GitHub. This means that all repositories will be read-only. If community members want to make changes, they are invited to fork the repositories and publish packages under their organization. We will shut down our free debugger service at the end of November. However, we just open sourced it, and they gave a link to that. Alternatively, people can use ngrok or one of our web chat widgets for local testing. We will shut down the Jovo website at the end of November. However, you can still access the documentation in open source repositories. Thank you to everyone who was part of this community and who participated in creating Jovo. It was really great to meet so many of you over the years, and we're really happy that we've been able to work on an open source project for such a long time. We won't forget all the cool skills, actions, bots, and apps that were created using Jovo. All the office hours, conferences, testing Tuesdays. It was an honor. Thank you, Alex and Jan."
So okay. So it sounds like we're losing the team that was moving this forward, but we're not losing the library itself.
Yeah.
And hopefully Alex and Jan are going on to bigger and better things.
Which I will be watching to see what they do,
Yes.
because they've proven themselves to me to be people that have quality ideas and quality implementations of those ideas. So I will definitely be on the lookout for what they are doing. Probably the path that I'll end up doing, since I've got active development on projects, and one of the things that that the builds do for Jovo is keep up to date, do some testing and stuff against current versions of Node.js. So that's gonna go away, and as you know, keeping up with Node.js is just like a continual.
Yeah, Node.js comes out with a new release every year, or two.
Yeah,
Release or two
yeah,
every year.
something like that. Yeah, it's pretty. So what I'm probably going to end up doing at that point is probably create a repo. I just changed, because right now I think it's at jovotech/framework is the name of the framework you can find on npm. So I'll just create a new one in some other organization so that it's available. Now, I don't know. There's other ideas that I'm kind of seeing how it might be adapted for other things. It might evolve from that fork point on. It might exclude some things, like I'm not actively doing Alexa development anymore, and can't really develop for Google anymore. So some of that code, it might just make sense to remove that to slim down the I guess the challenge of keeping those dependent libraries up to date. But I don't know. We'll kind of see how it goes. But I still feel like it's worthwhile, and I've got some money and time invested in it on projects that I'm working on. So we'll probably just move forward with some sort of a forked version of that.
That makes sense. And of course, we'll see where, if anything happens with Alexa development, or, what,
Yeah.
if any other bot platform does start coming out as the LLMs move in that direction.
Yeah, definitely. I'll be spending some time digging into the framework, which I have done quite a bit as well over the years, and was able to create a number of different plugins for different projects that I needed. I'm going to continue poking around the source code and see what new things I can learn.
All right.
Well, I just, thanks, Ellen, for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about Jovo. It's a project I've used. I've spent, thousands of hours using and developing for and participating. It's one of the open source projects that I've supported the most recently, and just I've really liked it.
And I think it's important to make this point that contributing to open source projects is important and it's
Yep,
meaningful. You know, I'm currently contributing to LangChain. I know others are contributing to GenKit or to other open source projects that are
yep,
out there. It's valuable and it's worthwhile, even when things like this eventually happen. That the project goes into maintenance mode or the project falls out of disuse in favor of something else. You
yep,
know, you've learned so much by contributing to the project, both in terms of new programming skills, new organization skills. We're learning how to work with other people, learning
yep.
how to build big projects. These are valuable skills, and open source is a great way to do it. So, how do you feel coming out of this? What do you feel like you've learned by contributing to this project?
Wow. A few things that I've learned is just how smart some people are. This project has saved me, lots and lots of hours. I'd say hundreds and hundreds of hours, because once you learn a framework and it seems to fit closely to the purpose that you're using it for, then things just go a lot faster.
Yeah.
And so I like one of the things I learned and that I like is the modularity of it, the kind of the pairing of the plugins to the pipeline. I think that's a concept that is very powerful, to use another P word, and I think that's I'm on the lookout for other opportunities where that is a good fit. So I think I've learned some, which has been great. I just have a great relationship with Jan and Alex. Just feel like they've were listening to feedback. They encourage people to contribute. Um, and it did feel like definitely a collaboration. You could do a pull request, and then there would be some sort of a conversation on maybe something that could be tweaked, and you understood kind of their viewpoint a little bit better. So there is definitely something to be learned when you feel like you're part of a team that's creating something as opposed to somebody that's just using an open source project.
All right. So I'd love to hear what other folks' experiences are, both with Jovo and with other open source projects that you may have contributed to. As always, you can find us on various social networks or leave comments down below. And we will be talking about all of this stuff other times on Two Voice Devs.
Two voice devs. Thanks, Ellen. And I'd like to think of this as an opportunity for celebration as well as just and just kind of commemorate the job well done for this project.
Well said.